Welcome to Eternal Darkness, where nightmares come to life. I'll be your host through these twisted tales tonight. Before we descend into the shadows, remember to like and subscribe to join our growing community of horror enthusiasts. Get comfortable, turn down the lights, and prepare yourself as we begin our journey into the unknown. The decision to venture into the remote wilderness areas of northern Pennsylvania came to us during one of those suffocating August nights in 2019 when our cramped apartment felt like a prison cell. The air conditioning had been broken for 3 days, and the landlord kept promising to send someone tomorrow. My boyfriend Jake, 26 at the time, had been scrolling through outdoor forums on his laptop, while I fanned myself with a magazine that had arrived in someone else's mail. "Look at this," he said, turning the screen toward me. The photograph showed an endless expanse of dense forest, broken only by a narrow dirt track that seemed to disappear into darkness between towering pines. No designated campsites, no fees, no crowds, just pure wilderness. At 24, I thought I was ready for anything. I'd grown up camping with my family in state parks, always surrounded by other families with their RVs and portable generators humming through the night. The idea of true isolation appealed to me in a way that now seems naive and reckless. We spent the next 2 hours researching the area, reading scattered reports from hikers who'd ventured into what locals called the backcountry, hundreds of square miles of largely unmapped forest land that stretched between abandoned mining towns. The warnings should have deterred us. Multiple forum posts mentioned getting lost for days, even with GPS devices. Others wrote about their vehicles getting stuck in mud that seemed to appear from nowhere, forcing them to hike miles back to the nearest road. One particularly unsettling account described finding abandoned campsites with personal belongings still scattered around cold fire pits, as if the occupants had simply vanished mid-meal. But we were young and convinced of our own invincibility. Jake had invested in a new 4-wheel drive pickup truck specifically for adventures like this, and I'd been practicing my wilderness survival skills through online courses and YouTube videos. We told ourselves we were prepared for anything nature could throw at us. The morning we left, August 15th, 2019, dawned gray and humid. By the time we loaded our gear and drove out of the city, thick clouds had gathered overhead, threatening rain that never quite materialized, but left the air heavy and oppressive. Our route took us northwest through increasingly rural areas, past farms that looked like they'd been abandoned decades ago, and gas stations with hand-painted signs advertising bait and ammunition. The last town worthy of the name was Millerville. Population 847, according to a weathered sign riddled with bullet holes. We stopped there to fill up the truck and grab extra water, both of us noting how the few locals we encountered watched us with expressions that fell somewhere between curiosity and concern. An elderly man pumping gas at the station next to us shook his head when he overheard Jake mentioning our destination. "You kids know what you're getting into out there?" he asked, his voice carrying the authority of someone who'd lived in these mountains his entire life. "That's rough country, easy to get turned around, easier to get stuck. Cell phones don't work for miles in any direction." Jake assured him we were experienced campers, which wasn't entirely false, but wasn't entirely true either. Our experience had been limited to established campgrounds with bathroom facilities and marked trails. This would be our first venture into truly primitive conditions. "Your funeral?" the old man muttered, but not quietly enough that we couldn't hear him. Looking back, I wonder if he knew something we didn't. If he'd heard stories about that particular stretch of wilderness that never made it into the hiking forums or guidebooks. Stories that locals kept to themselves, understanding instinctively that some knowledge was too dangerous to share with outsiders who might not take the warnings seriously. The paved road ended about 40 minutes outside Millerville, giving way to a well-maintained gravel surface that stretched for another 20 miles through rolling hills dotted with deer stands and the occasional hunting cabin. But even that civilized gravel eventually deteriorated into the kind of rough track that Jake's truck was supposedly designed to handle. What we encountered instead was something that tested both the vehicle and our nerves. The path, calling it a road would have been generous, consisted of parallel ruts carved through dense clay soil that had been churned into a consistency somewhere between mud and quicksand by recent rains. Fallen branches blocked sections of the route, forcing us to stop repeatedly so I could clear debris while Jake maneuvered around washouts that looked capable of swallowing the truck entirely. The trees pressed in from both sides, their branches scraping against the windows with sounds like fingernails on chalkboard. What little sunlight penetrated the canopy created a sickly green twilight that made it impossible to judge distances accurately. More than once, Jake had to reverse and try a different approach when what looked like solid ground turned out to be camouflaged water standing several inches deep. "This is insane," I remember saying after we'd been crawling forward at walking speed for nearly an hour. "We should turn back." But turning back would have required finding a spot wide enough to execute a three-point turn, and the track had been steadily narrowing. Behind us, our tire tracks had already filled with muddy water, making our route look less like a road and more like a creek bed. The realization that we were committed to pushing forward, regardless of what lay ahead, sent the first real tendrils of anxiety creeping up my spine. Jake tried to maintain an optimistic attitude, pointing out wildlife tracks in the mud and commenting on the impressive size of the trees surrounding us. But I caught him checking the fuel gauge more frequently than necessary, and his knuckles were white where he gripped the steering wheel. We'd already used more gas than anticipated just navigating the treacherous surface, and neither of us wanted to voice the possibility that we might not have enough to make it back to Millerville. The deeper we penetrated into the wilderness, the more oppressive the silence became. In normal forests, you expect to hear birds calling, insects buzzing, the rustle of small animals moving through undergrowth. Here, the only sounds were the labored growling of our engine and the wet sucking noise our tires made as they fought for traction in the increasingly unstable soil. It was this unnatural quiet that first made me wonder if we'd made a terrible mistake. After what felt like hours of fighting through mud and debris, we finally reached a section where the track widened slightly and the surface improved enough that Jake could shift out of first gear. The relief was enormous. Both of us had been holding our breath, waiting for the moment when the truck would finally give up and leave us stranded miles from anywhere. That's when we saw the vehicle. It sat off to the left side of the track, a battered pickup truck that looked like it had been manufactured sometime in the 1980s. The paint had faded to an indeterminate color somewhere between brown and rust, and both bumpers were held in place with what appeared to be baling wire and determination. The hood was propped open with a stick, creating a black cavity that should have contained an engine but instead seemed to swallow light. What immediately caught our attention, though, wasn't the truck itself, but the figure standing beside it. She was a woman, probably in her 50s, wearing clothing that looked like it had been assembled from a thrift store specializing in workwear from previous decades. Faded blue jeans that had been repaired multiple times with mismatched patches, a flannel shirt in a pattern that might once have been red and black plaid, and heavy boots that were caked with mud despite the fact that the ground around her truck appeared relatively dry. But it was her posture that made both Jake and me uncomfortable. She wasn't bent over the engine, wasn't waving for help, wasn't displaying any of the typical behaviors you'd expect from someone dealing with vehicle trouble in the middle of nowhere. Instead, she stood perfectly upright beside the driver's door, her arms hanging loose at her sides, facing the track as if she'd been waiting for us specifically. Jake slowed our truck to a crawl, both of us automatically preparing to offer assistance. In normal circumstances, encountering someone with car trouble on a remote road would trigger an immediate helping response. You stop, you ask what's wrong, you offer to share tools or provide a ride to the nearest town. It's basic human decency, especially in areas where the next passerby might not appear for days. But something about this woman's demeanor made both of us hesitate. Her gaze locked onto our windshield with an intensity that was deeply unsettling. She wasn't looking at us the way someone looks at potential rescuers. She was studying us, evaluating us, as if we were specimens that had wandered into her laboratory. Her eyes, and from 20 feet away, I could somehow tell they were pale blue, the kind of washed-out color you see in old photographs, never wavered from our vehicle. Should we stop? I asked, though every instinct in my body was screaming at me to keep driving. Jake's foot hovered over the brake pedal. I could see him wrestling with the same conflict between social obligation and primal fear that was paralyzing me. We were both raised to help people in distress, but nothing about this woman suggested distress. If anything, she radiated a calm confidence that was completely at odds with her circumstances. "Something's not right," Jake finally said, and pressed down on the accelerator instead of the brake. As we approached her position, the woman's head turned to track our movement with mechanical precision. Her expression never changed, not disappointed that we weren't stopping, not angry that we were leaving her stranded, not even curious about who we were or where we were going. She simply watched us pass with the same neutral intensity she'd been displaying since we first spotted her. But it was what happened next that convinced me we'd made the right decision. Just as we drew parallel to her truck, she smiled. It wasn't a friendly smile, or a reassuring smile, or even a sad smile, acknowledging that help had passed her by. It was the kind of smile that belongs in nightmares, too wide, revealing too many teeth, holding promises that no sane person would want to hear. The expression transformed her entire face, changing her from merely unusual to genuinely frightening. Jake accelerated harder, and I found myself twisted around in my seat, watching her through the rear window. She remained in that same position, standing beside her truck, smiling that horrible smile, watching us recede into the distance. She didn't wave goodbye, didn't shout after us, didn't even move to close her hood. She just stood there like a statue commemorating something best forgotten. "What the hell was that about?" I asked. But Jake was focused on navigating another section of particularly treacherous mud and didn't answer immediately. When we'd put several hundred yards between ourselves and the woman, I finally turned back around in my seat. My heart was still pounding, and I realized I'd been holding my breath for the better part of a minute. "I don't know," Jake finally replied. "But I'm glad we didn't stop." We continued down the track in tense silence, both of us processing what we just experienced. On one level, it was nothing more than an awkward encounter with a local who might have mental health issues or simply different social expectations than what we were used to. Rural areas often harbored individuals who'd been living in isolation for so long that normal human interaction became difficult or impossible. But on another level, something about the entire scene felt staged. The truck positioned just so beside the track, the woman standing in exactly the right spot to be visible from a distance, her immediate and unwavering focus on our vehicle as if she'd been expecting us. The more I thought about it, the more convinced I became that we'd stumbled into some kind of trap. Though what kind of trap and for what purpose, I couldn't begin to imagine. "Maybe she was just hoping for help," I offered, though I didn't believe it myself. "Maybe," Jake agreed, but his tone suggested he wasn't buying that explanation either. We drove for another 15 minutes before either of us spoke again, too shaken by the encounter to engage in normal conversation. The track continued to wind through increasingly dense forest, and I found myself checking the side mirrors compulsively, half expecting to see that battered pickup truck following us despite the impossibility of her getting it running and turned around in the time since we'd passed her. The rational part of my mind kept insisting that we were overreacting, that isolation and stress were making us paranoid about a perfectly innocent encounter. But my gut told a different story. My gut said we'd just had our first glimpse of something that didn't want to be understood, only avoided. Unfortunately, we were already too far committed to our route to turn back, and the woman now knew exactly which direction we were heading. The track finally opened into what might generously be called a clearing, though it was really just a spot where the trees had been knocked down by some long-ago storm and never replaced. Fallen logs created natural boundaries around an area roughly the size of a basketball court, covered in grass that had grown up wild and tall before being beaten down by rain and time into a mat that squelched underfoot. Jake parked the truck at the far end of the clearing, positioning it so we could make a quick exit if necessary, though I didn't realize at the time that this precaution was deliberate. Looking back, I think some part of him was already sensing that this place might not offer the peaceful retreat we'd been seeking. The ground was softer than it appeared, and every step we took left deep impressions that immediately filled with muddy water. Within minutes of unloading our gear, both of us were caked in mud up to our ankles, and the supposedly waterproof boots I'd spent a fortune on were proving to be anything but. "This is perfect," I said, trying to inject some enthusiasm into a situation that was rapidly proving to be less than ideal. No crowds, no noise, just us and nature. Jake nodded and smiled, but I caught him scanning the tree line with the kind of systematic attention that suggested he was looking for something specific. When I asked him about it, he claimed he was just checking for widowmakers, dead branches that might fall and cause injury. But his explanation felt rehearsed. Setting up our tent required more creativity than either of us had anticipated. The ground was too soft to hold stakes properly, forcing us to tie guy lines to the surrounding logs and weigh down the corners with rocks scavenged from what appeared to be the remains of an old campfire ring. Previous visitors had left behind a collection of beer bottles, food wrappers, and other debris that suggested this spot was more popular than its remote location might indicate. But it was the arrangement of that debris that first struck me as odd. Instead of being scattered randomly the way trash usually accumulates at informal campsites, everything was positioned in neat piles at specific intervals around the clearing's perimeter, almost as if someone had been using the litter to mark boundaries or create signals that other people would recognize and understand. "Weird way to leave a campsite," I commented, kicking at a pile of cigarette butts that had been carefully arranged in a perfect circle around a beer bottle. Jake looked where I was pointing and frowned. Maybe they were trying to clean up but got interrupted. It was a reasonable explanation, but it didn't account for the deliberate precision of the arrangements. These weren't the random efforts of campers attempting to be responsible about their waste. Someone had spent time and thought organizing these piles, investing effort in creating patterns that served no practical purpose. As we worked to establish our temporary home, other details began to register that should have served as warnings. The trees surrounding the clearing bore scars that looked fresh, long gouges in the bark that were too uniform to have been caused by animals and too high off the ground to have resulted from normal camping activities. Several of the fallen logs showed evidence of recent saw work, with clean cuts that suggested someone had been deliberately modifying the landscape. Most disturbing were the remains of previous campfires. Instead of a single fire ring that multiple visitors had used over time, the clearing contained at least 6 separate burn areas scattered around its perimeter. Each was small, barely large enough to accommodate a few pieces of firewood, and positioned to provide a clear view of different sections of the surrounding forest. "Looks like this place gets more visitors than we thought," Jake observed, though his tone suggested he wasn't entirely pleased by this discovery. I tried to remain optimistic. "At least we know other people have camped here successfully." But even as I said it, I wondered about the definition of successfully. The evidence suggested that multiple groups had used this clearing, but there was something frantic about the way they'd arranged their camps. The scattered fire rings looked less like casual campsites and more like defensive positions, each one positioned to provide maximum visibility while remaining concealed from specific directions. We spent the afternoon organizing our gear and attempting to make the best of our soggy surroundings. The weather remained overcast and humid, creating the kind of oppressive atmosphere that makes even simple tasks feel exhausting. Sweat mixed with mud until both of us looked like we'd been rolling in a swamp, and the constant moisture made it impossible to feel clean or comfortable. But it was the silence that gradually became most unnerving. In healthy forests, you expect a constant background symphony of bird calls, insect activity, and small animals moving through undergrowth. Here, the only sounds were the ones we made ourselves: our footsteps, our voices, the rustle of equipment being moved around. Even the wind seemed muted, as if the trees were absorbing sound rather than allowing it to carry. "Kind of quiet, isn't it?" I mentioned during one of several awkward pauses in our conversation. Jake nodded slowly. "Yeah, really quiet." We both stood there for a moment, listening to the absence of normal forest sounds and trying to convince ourselves that there was a reasonable explanation. Maybe we'd arrived during a natural lull in wildlife activity. Maybe the recent weather had disrupted normal patterns. Maybe we were simply too accustomed to urban noise pollution to appreciate genuine tranquility. But neither of us bought any of those explanations. The silence felt deliberate, as if everything that normally lived in these woods had found reasons to be elsewhere, or had been given reasons to be elsewhere. As evening approached, we attempted to build a fire using wood scavenged from the abundant deadfall surrounding the clearing. The logs were all damp from recent rains, producing more smoke than heat, and filling our small space with acrid fumes that made our eyes water and our throats burn. But the alternative, spending the night in complete darkness, seemed even less appealing. While Jake struggled with the reluctant fire, I took a walk around the perimeter of the clearing, partly to stretch my legs and partly to get a better sense of our surroundings. What I found during that circuit increased my unease rather than relieving it. Several of the trees bore markings that definitely weren't natural. Carved symbols that might have been initials or might have been something else entirely, scratched into bark at eye level where they'd be impossible to miss. Some appeared fresh, while others had partially healed over, suggesting that people had been visiting this spot and leaving marks for years or even decades. But it was the pattern of the markings that disturbed me most. They weren't randomly distributed around the clearing's perimeter. Instead, they followed a specific sequence, with each symbol positioned to be visible from the previous one, creating a trail that led completely around the clearing before returning to its starting point. Someone had turned our campsite into a circuit, and I had no idea what purpose that circuit was supposed to serve. The fire finally caught properly just as the sun began its descent behind the trees, casting long shadows across our clearing that seemed to reach toward us like grasping fingers. Jake and I sat on a fallen log that we dragged closer to the flames, sharing a dinner of trail mix and energy bars, while trying to maintain conversation that felt increasingly forced and artificial. That's when we heard the engine. At first, it was just a distant rumble that could have been mistaken for thunder or machinery operating miles away. But as the sound grew closer, it resolved into the distinctive pattern of an internal combustion engine struggling with rough terrain. Someone else was navigating the same treacherous track we'd used to reach this clearing. Maybe it's the woman with the broken-down truck, I suggested, though I didn't believe it myself. The engine we were hearing sounded different. Smaller, rougher, like a vehicle that had seen too many hard miles and not enough maintenance. Jake stood up from the log, his posture suddenly alert in a way that made my stomach clench with anxiety. That's not the same truck. The sound grew steadily louder, accompanied by the wet grinding noise of tires fighting for traction in mud. Whoever was approaching was taking the same route we had, following our tire tracks deeper into the wilderness, and they were coming directly toward our campsite. Within minutes, headlights appeared through the trees, two pale beams that swept back and forth as the vehicle navigated the worst sections of the track. The lights disappeared and reappeared as the route curved, but each time they returned, they were closer and brighter. "Should we put out the fire?" I asked, suddenly conscious of how visible our position had become in the gathering darkness. "Too late for that," Jake replied. "They already know we're here." The vehicle finally emerged from the tree line, a sedan that looked like it had been assembled from parts scavenged from several different cars. The front panel was a different color than the doors, the rear bumper was held in place with rope, and one headlight was significantly dimmer than the other, giving the entire vehicle a lopsided, threatening appearance. But it was the way the driver behaved that transformed this encounter from merely unusual to genuinely frightening. Instead of pulling into our clearing or stopping to introduce himself, the sedan crept past our campsite at walking speed. The driver, a shadowy figure whose features were impossible to make out through tinted windows, turned his head to stare directly at us as he passed. Not a casual glance or a friendly wave, but the kind of sustained, evaluating stare that made both Jake and me instinctively step closer to each other. The car continued down the track until its taillights disappeared around the next bend, leaving us alone with the crackling fire and a growing sense of unease. "What do you think that was about?" I asked, though I dreaded hearing Jake's answer. "I don't know, but I don't like it." We sat back down on our log, both of us facing the direction the car had gone and listening for any indication that it might be returning. The forest had returned to its unnatural silence, broken only by the occasional pop from our fire and the distant sound of the sedan's engine growing fainter as it continued deeper into the wilderness. 20 minutes passed without incident. We began to relax slightly, convincing ourselves that we'd simply encountered another camper who was looking for his own isolated spot to spend the night. Maybe he'd even been as startled to see us as we'd been to see him. Maybe the long stare had been nothing more than natural curiosity about fellow travelers in such a remote location. Then the headlights appeared again. This time they were approaching from the opposite direction, suggesting that the driver had turned around somewhere ahead and was now retracing his route. But instead of simply passing our campsite a second time, the sedan slowed to a complete stop directly across from our fire. For several minutes, nothing happened. The car sat there with its engine idling roughly, its lone functioning headlight illuminating a section of forest on the far side of the clearing. The driver remained motionless behind the wheel, a dark silhouette that seemed to be studying us with the same unnatural intensity we'd encountered from the woman by the broken-down truck. Jake's hand found mine in the darkness, and I realized both of us were trembling. Not from cold. The night was still warm and humid, but from a fear that had no rational basis and no easy explanation. We were simply two young people camping in a public forest, and this was simply another traveler using the same road. There was no logical reason for the encounter to feel threatening. But logic had nothing to do with the primitive alarm bells that were screaming in both our heads. "What's he waiting for?" I whispered, though I was afraid that speaking too loudly might somehow provoke whatever was happening. "I don't know," Jake whispered back, and I could hear the tension in his voice. "Maybe we should go sit in the truck." Before we could act on that suggestion, the sedan's engine revved, and the vehicle lurched forward, continuing down the track in the same direction it had originally been traveling. Within moments, its taillights had disappeared again, leaving us alone with our racing hearts and growing paranoia. But our relief was short-lived, because 15 minutes later, the headlights appeared for a third time. Now there was no possibility of innocent explanation. The driver was deliberately circling our campsite, using the track as a loop that allowed him to pass our position repeatedly, while maintaining the pretense that he was simply traveling through the area. Each time he appeared, he slowed to observe us for several minutes before continuing on his circuit. "This is not normal," I said, abandoning any attempt to whisper. "Normal people don't do this." Jake stood up again, and this time he walked to the truck and returned with something I couldn't see clearly in the firelight. When he sat back down beside me, I realized he was holding the machete we'd packed for clearing brush. "What are you planning to do with that?" I asked, though part of me was relieved that we had some form of weapon available. "Hopefully nothing," he replied. "But if he stops and gets out of the car..." He didn't finish the sentence, but I understood. We were alone in the wilderness with someone whose behavior suggested either mental illness or predatory intent. Our nearest neighbors were either the mysterious woman with the broken-down truck, assuming she was still where we'd left her, or the population of Millerville, more than an hour's drive through treacherous terrain. If this situation escalated beyond verbal intimidation, we would be entirely on our own. The sedan made 2 more circuits, each time slowing to observe us before continuing its seemingly endless loop. By the 4th pass, both Jake and I were standing beside the fire, no longer even pretending to be relaxed. We watched the headlights approach, counted the minutes while the driver stared at us, then tracked the taillights until they disappeared around the bend. "We should leave," I said during one of the intervals between visits. "Pack up everything and get out of here right now." Jake nodded. "Yeah, this is getting too weird." But even as we began discussing our escape, both of us realized the practical difficulties involved. Loading our gear in the dark would be noisy and time-consuming, potentially alerting our unwelcome visitor that we were preparing to flee. Worse, our only route out was the same track he was using for his circuits. If we encountered him head-on in a narrow section where passing was impossible, we'd be trapped with nowhere to run. Maybe he'll get bored and leave, I suggested without much conviction. Maybe, Jake agreed, but his grip on the machete suggested he wasn't counting on it. As if summoned by our conversation, the headlights appeared again, approaching from the same direction as before. But this time, something was different. Instead of the steady beam we'd grown accustomed to, the light was flickering irregularly, creating a strobe effect that was deeply disorienting. The sedan crept into view, moving even slower than before, and I realized that the flickering wasn't caused by a malfunctioning headlight. The driver was deliberately turning his lights on and off, creating a signal that might have been an attempt at communication, or might have been something far more sinister. This time, when the car stopped across from our campsite, the engine didn't continue idling. Instead, it shut off completely, plunging that section of forest into darkness and silence. We could hear the driver's door opening. The metallic groan of the car door opening cut through the night air like a blade, followed by the soft thud of it closing again. In the flickering light from our fire, I could just make out a dark figure moving around the sedan, but the flames created too much contrast for me to see any details beyond a basic human silhouette. Jake's hand tightened on the machete handle, and I could hear his breathing becoming shallow and rapid. My own heart was hammering so hard I was certain it must be audible across the clearing. Every primitive survival instinct inherited from thousands of generations of ancestors was screaming at me to run, but my legs felt like they'd been filled with concrete. The figure moved slowly around the perimeter of our campsite, staying just outside the circle of firelight where we could track his movement without being able to see him clearly. He wasn't attempting to hide or sneak up on us. Quite the opposite. His footsteps were deliberately heavy, his path obvious, as if he wanted us to know exactly where he was at all times. "What do you want?" Jake called out, his voice carrying an authority I didn't think he actually felt. "We're just camping here for the night." The figure stopped moving but didn't respond. In the dancing shadows created by our fire, I could see that he was facing our direction, but his features remained completely obscured. The silence stretched on for what felt like hours, but was probably only 30 or 40 seconds. When he finally spoke, his voice was rough and gravelly, like someone who'd spent years smoking unfiltered cigarettes or breathing industrial fumes. "Nice spot you picked," he said. "Real private. Nobody around for miles." The words themselves weren't threatening, but the tone carried implications that made my skin crawl. This wasn't small talk between fellow campers. This was a predator letting his prey know that they were isolated and vulnerable. "We'll be leaving in the morning," I called out, trying to keep my voice steady. "Just passing through." The figure resumed walking, completing his circuit around our campsite before stopping directly across the fire from where we stood. Now I could see him more clearly. A tall, thin man wearing dark clothing that might have been military surplus, or might have been work clothes that had seen too many years of hard use. His face remained in shadow, but I could see the gleam of eyes reflecting the firelight. "No rush," he said. "Stay as long as you like. I'm in no hurry." That last sentence sent ice water through my veins. It implied that he was planning to wait, to observe, to maintain his presence until... What? What was he waiting for? Jake stepped forward slightly, placing himself between the stranger and me. "Look, we don't want any trouble. We're just camping. If this is your spot, we can find somewhere else." The man tilted his head slightly, and I caught a glimpse of what might have been a smile. "Oh, this isn't my spot, but I know who uses it." The way he emphasized uses made it clear that camping wasn't the primary activity he was referring to. The careful arrangement of trash we'd noticed earlier, the multiple fire rings, the carved symbols on the trees. Suddenly, all of those details took on a much more sinister significance. "What do you mean?" I asked, though I wasn't sure I wanted to hear the answer. Instead of responding, the man reached into his jacket and pulled out something that caught the firelight. At first, I thought it might be a weapon, but as he held it up, I realized it was a camera. An old-fashioned camera with a large lens and an electronic flash attachment. "Mind if I take a few pictures?" he asked. "For the records." "Records?" Jake's voice had climbed several octaves higher. "What kind of records?" The man raised the camera to his eye, and the flash went off with a brilliant white burst that left both of us temporarily blinded. By the time our vision cleared, he'd moved to a different position and was preparing to take another shot. "Stop that!" Jake shouted, but the man triggered the flash again, then again, moving around our campsite like a professional photographer documenting a crime scene. Each flash was disorienting, destroying our night vision, and making it impossible to track the man's movements effectively. Between the bursts of light, he seemed to teleport from one location to another, always staying just outside our reach while maintaining his systematic documentation of our presence. "Please stop," I begged, but he continued taking pictures with mechanical precision. The camera's electronic whir and the charging sound of the flash unit created a rhythmic pattern that was somehow more frightening than complete silence would have been. After what felt like dozens of photographs, the man finally lowered his camera and tucked it back into his jacket. In the aftermath of the repeated flashes, the fire seemed dimmer, and the surrounding darkness appeared to have crept closer to our small circle of safety. "That should do it," he said with obvious satisfaction. "Got some good shots." "What are you going to do with those pictures?" I asked. "Share them with friends," he replied. "People who might be interested in your visit." The implications of that statement hit me like a physical blow. He wasn't working alone. Somewhere in this wilderness, other people were waiting for information about travelers who ventured into isolated areas. People who might be interested in knowing that two young campers had made themselves vulnerable in a location where help was impossible to summon. "We're leaving," Jake announced, his voice shaking with barely controlled fear. "Right now." "Suit yourself," the man said. "But you might want to wait until morning. These roads can be dangerous in the dark. Easy to get lost, easy to have an accident." The threat was barely veiled. If we attempted to leave now, something would happen to prevent our escape. Whether that something was mechanical sabotage, a blocked road, or direct confrontation didn't matter. The message was clear. We were expected to remain in this clearing until whoever was coming to collect us arrived. "We'll take our chances," Jake said, but I could hear the uncertainty in his voice. The man shrugged. "Your choice. I'll be around if you change your mind." He turned and walked back toward his sedan, his footsteps crunching through the dead leaves and debris scattered around the clearing's perimeter. We heard the car door open and close, followed by the rough cough of the engine turning over. But instead of driving away, he simply sat there with the engine idling and the headlights pointed directly at our campsite. The message was unmistakable. He wasn't leaving. He was settling in for a long wait. Jake and I looked at each other across the fire, both of us understanding that our peaceful camping trip had transformed into something else entirely. We were no longer visitors to this wilderness. We were prey, trapped in an elaborate snare that we'd walked into voluntarily and now couldn't escape. "What do we do?" I whispered. Jake's eyes were fixed on the sedan's headlights, calculating distances and possibilities. "We pack up as quietly as possible. Then we make a run for it." "What if he follows us?" "Then we drive as fast as we can and hope we reach the main road before he catches up." It wasn't much of a plan, but it was the only option we had. The alternative, waiting passively while unknown threats gathered in the darkness around us, wasn't really an alternative at all. We began moving our gear with deliberate stealth, trying not to create any obvious signs that we were preparing to flee. But with every item we loaded into the truck, I became more convinced that our efforts were futile. The man in the sedan was watching our every move, and he'd already demonstrated that he had resources and planning capabilities that we couldn't hope to match. Worse, I was beginning to suspect that our current predicament was exactly what he'd been hoping to achieve. That the photographs, the threats, the psychological pressure were all designed to force us into making a desperate escape attempt that would play directly into whatever trap was waiting for us down the track. But staying wasn't an option either. Because somewhere in the darkness beyond our fire, other people were almost certainly moving into position, guided by the photographs that documented our exact location and current status. We were going to have to run, even though running might be exactly what our hunters wanted us to do. We managed to load most of our gear into the truck without attracting obvious attention from our unwanted observer. The man in the sedan remained motionless, his headlights creating a steady glare that made it difficult to see anything beyond our immediate campsite. But I had the unsettling feeling that he was watching our every movement, cataloging our preparations and probably communicating our plans to others through means we couldn't detect. Jake was securing the last of our equipment when we heard it, a sound that made both of us freeze in terror. It started as a low grinding noise, like metal scraping against stone, coming from somewhere deep in the forest beyond the sedan's position. At first, it was barely audible over the idling engine, but it gradually grew louder and more distinct. Whatever was creating the sound was moving, approaching our location through the dense undergrowth that surrounded the clearing. "What is that?" I whispered, though I was afraid that speaking might somehow attract the attention of whatever was making the noise. Jake shook his head, his face pale in the firelight. "I don't know, but we need to leave. Right now." The grinding sound was accompanied by another noise, a rhythmic thumping that suggested something heavy being dragged across uneven ground. Together, the sounds created an audio signature unlike anything I'd ever heard, something that belonged in nightmares rather than real life. The man in the sedan must have heard it too, because his engine suddenly revved and his headlights began moving as he repositioned his vehicle. But instead of driving away from the approaching sounds, he appeared to be moving closer to their source, as if coordinating with whatever was making its way through the forest. "They're working together," I realized with growing horror. "This is all planned." Jake grabbed my arm and pulled me toward our truck. "Get in. We're leaving right now." But as we reached the driver's door, the grinding sound suddenly intensified, joined by what could only be described as mechanical screaming. The sound of metal being torn apart by forces that had never been designed to work in harmony. Whatever was approaching was large, powerful, and apparently malfunctioning in ways that made its operation increasingly unstable. Through the trees, I caught a glimpse of light that was different from the sedan's headlights. This was a harsh white glare that strobed irregularly, creating a disorienting effect that made it impossible to judge distances or directions accurately. The light was accompanied by clouds of what looked like smoke or steam, suggesting that the approaching machine was overheating or burning fuel at an unsustainable rate. "Oh God," Jake breathed, and I followed his gaze to see what had captured his attention. At the edge of the clearing, barely visible in the chaotic mix of firelight and strobing glare, something was emerging from the forest. At first, I thought it might be another vehicle, some kind of all-terrain machine capable of navigating terrain that would be impossible for normal cars or trucks. But as more of it became visible, I realized that I was looking at something that had never been designed for transportation. It was a collection of mechanical parts that seemed to have been welded together without regard for engineering principles or safety considerations. Pieces of farm equipment were combined with automotive components and industrial machinery in ways that created a nightmare amalgamation of metal, rubber, and exposed electrical systems. The entire contraption moved on treads that looked like they'd been salvaged from military vehicles, but the treads themselves had been modified with additional metal plates and what appeared to be cutting implements. But it was the purpose of the machine that filled me with absolute terror. Mounted on the front was a cage-like structure just large enough to hold 2 people, with restraints that had obviously been designed to prevent escape. This wasn't a vehicle. It was a mobile prison, built specifically for capturing and transporting human beings who couldn't fight back effectively. The machine lurched into the clearing with mechanical groans that suggested its various components were fighting against each other with every movement. Sparks flew from exposed electrical connections, and the thick black smoke pouring from its exhaust system created a toxic cloud that made my eyes water and my throat burn. Behind the controls sat a figure wearing what looked like military surplus gear and a gas mask that concealed his entire face. He operated the machine with practiced efficiency, suggesting that this wasn't the first time he'd used it for its intended purpose. "Run!" Jake shouted, but I was already moving toward our truck. We threw ourselves into the cab and Jake turned the key, but instead of the reliable rumble of our engine, we heard only a weak clicking sound. He tried again with the same result, then a third time before the horrible truth became obvious. "Someone tampered with our truck," he said, his voice barely audible over the approaching machine. I looked through the windshield and saw the man in the sedan climbing out of his vehicle. In the chaotic light, I could see that he was smiling. The same horrible expression we'd encountered on the woman by the broken-down truck. This had all been planned from the moment we'd first appeared on their remote road. Every detail had been orchestrated to drive us to this exact spot, where we'd be trapped with no possibility of escape. The mechanical monstrosity was now close enough that I could see its operator clearly. The gas mask couldn't conceal the fact that he was staring directly at us, his head turning to track our movements with mechanical precision. The cage mounted on the front of his machine was already open, its restraints positioned to accommodate 2 people of approximately our size. Jake tried the ignition one more time, and miraculously, the engine coughed to life. But our relief was short-lived, because the mechanical creature had positioned itself to block our only exit from the clearing. Its operator was revving the engine, creating clouds of noxious smoke while demonstrating the various cutting implements attached to the machine's treads. "Back up," I said. "Go through the forest." "The trees are too close together," Jake replied, but he was already shifting into reverse. "We'll get stuck." "Better than getting caught," I said, and he nodded grimly. We began backing toward the tree line, our headlights illuminating a maze of trunks and undergrowth that looked impossible to navigate. But impossible was better than certain capture, and the mechanical monstrosity was already moving to intercept us. Behind us, I could hear the sound of branches scraping against our truck's sides and roof. Several times we had to stop and maneuver around obstacles that would have blocked our progress entirely. But somehow we managed to penetrate the forest far enough that the pursuing machine couldn't follow. At least, not immediately. The sound of chainsaws starting up told us that our pursuers weren't giving up easily. They were simply switching to different tools, ones better suited for clearing the path we'd use to escape. "They're going to cut their way through," I said, watching the strobing lights moving through the trees behind us. "They're going to follow us." Jake found a space wide enough to turn around, and we began moving deeper into the forest, using what appeared to be an old deer trail to navigate between the largest trees. Our headlights carved a narrow tunnel through the darkness, but beyond that tunnel, we could hear the sounds of our pursuers getting closer with every passing minute. The chainsaws were making quick work of the obstacles that had temporarily saved us. Soon, the mechanical prison would be mobile again, and it would be following our tracks through terrain where our truck's advantages were minimal, and our options for escape were rapidly diminishing. We needed to find a way back to the main road, but we were lost in a wilderness that was controlled by people who knew every trail, every shortcut, every dead end that might trap unwary travelers. People who had obviously been hunting human prey in these woods for far longer than we'd realized. Our truck bounced and lurched through the forest, following what might charitably be called an animal trail, but was really just a slightly less dense arrangement of trees and undergrowth. Branches scraped against our windows with sounds like fingernails on chalkboard, and several times we had to stop completely while Jake maneuvered around fallen logs that blocked our path entirely. Behind us, the sound of chainsaws was getting steadily closer, accompanied by the mechanical roar of the pursuing machine as it forced its way through obstacles that would have stopped normal vehicles. Our brief head start was evaporating rapidly, and it was becoming clear that our pursuers knew this terrain far better than we did. "There!" I shouted, pointing to what looked like a wider gap between trees about 50 yards ahead. "That might be another road." Jake accelerated toward the opening, our truck's engine screaming as it fought for traction on the uneven ground. We burst through the gap and found ourselves on what was definitely a road. Not much of one, but a genuine dirt track that had been carved out of the forest specifically for vehicle traffic. "Which way?" Jake asked, the truck idling while we tried to get our bearings. To our left, the road curved away into darkness, following what appeared to be a natural valley between hills. To our right, it climbed steeply upward, disappearing over a ridge that might offer a view of the surrounding area. Both directions were unknown quantities, but at least they were actual roads rather than the maze of animal trails we'd been navigating. The decision was made for us when lights appeared through the trees behind our position. Our pursuers had reached the road and were now fully mobile again. The mechanical monstrosity emerged from the forest like something from an industrial nightmare, its various components sparking and smoking as the operator pushed it beyond its design limits. "Go left," I said. "Downhill should be easier on the truck." Jake floored the accelerator, and we shot down the declining road with a speed that was probably reckless given the conditions. But reckless was better than captured, and the sounds behind us suggested that our pursuers were gaining ground despite their machine's obvious mechanical problems. The road wound through dense forest for what felt like miles, occasionally branching into smaller tracks that disappeared into the darkness. Each time we encountered an intersection, Jake had to make split-second decisions about which route might lead to safety, and which might lead to dead ends where we'd be trapped like animals in a cage. Most terrifying was the realization that our pursuers seemed to know exactly where each road led. Several times we glimpsed lights approaching from different directions, suggesting that multiple vehicles were now involved in tracking us. What had started as an encounter with a single suspicious individual had escalated into a coordinated hunt involving resources and manpower that spoke to a much larger operation. "They're hurting us," I realized with growing horror. "They know where these roads go. They're forcing us towards something." Jake's knuckles were white where he gripped the steering wheel, his attention divided between navigating the treacherous road and monitoring the mirrors for signs of pursuit. "What do you mean?" "Think about it," I said, my mind racing as pieces of the puzzle clicked into place. The woman by the broken truck. She was positioned to make sure we went down the right road. The man with the camera. He was documenting our presence for people who weren't there yet. This whole thing is organized. They've done this before. The implications of that realization were almost too horrible to process. Somewhere in this wilderness, other travelers had found themselves in similar situations. People who'd been drawn to remote locations by the promise of solitude and natural beauty, only to discover that they'd walked into carefully prepared traps. And given the elaborate nature of the hunting operation we'd encountered, it seemed unlikely that many of those previous victims had successfully escaped. Our road began climbing again, winding up the side of a steep hill through switchbacks that forced Jake to slow down significantly. Behind us, the pursuing lights were getting closer, no longer hindered by the need to clear obstacles or navigate unknown terrain. On an established road, the mechanical prison was apparently capable of much higher speeds than its appearance had suggested. "There's something ahead," Jake said, pointing to a structure that was becoming visible at the top of the hill. As we got closer, I could see that it was some kind of building, a long, low structure that might have been a hunting lodge or ranger station in better days. But even in the darkness, it was obvious that the building had been abandoned for years. Broken windows, collapsed sections of roof, and walls covered in graffiti suggested that whatever legitimate purpose it might once have served had been forgotten long ago. "Don't stop," I said, though Jake was already accelerating past the structure. "That's probably where they want us to go." But as we drove past the building, I caught a glimpse of something that made my blood freeze. In what had once been the parking area, several vehicles were arranged in neat rows. Cars, trucks, and motorcycles of various ages and conditions, all sitting silent and dark in the night air. They weren't the vehicles of hunters or park rangers. They were too diverse, too obviously civilian, representing decades of different models and manufacturers. They looked like the abandoned property of people who'd arrived at this location expecting to leave again but somehow never managed to complete that journey. "Oh God," I whispered. "Those are their cars. The people they caught. All those cars belong to people who never made it home." Jake's foot pressed harder on the accelerator, and our truck shot past the building complex with a speed that was probably dangerous on the winding road. But the alternative, slowing down to examine the evidence of previous crimes, might have been fatal. Behind us, the pursuing lights had crested the hill and were now bearing down on our position with renewed intensity. I could see multiple vehicles now, spread out across the road in a formation that was clearly designed to prevent our escape if we tried to reverse direction. "There's a fork ahead," Jake said, and I could see he was right. The road split into two branches, one continuing straight ahead while the other curved sharply to the right and disappeared into a different section of forest. "Which way?" I asked, though I suspected that both options led to predetermined destinations that our hunters had selected long before we'd ever arrived in this wilderness. "Right," Jake decided, and swung the wheel hard as we approached the intersection. The road immediately became rougher, suggesting that this branch received less maintenance than the main route. Our truck bounced and shuddered as we navigated potholes and washouts that threatened to trap us or damage our vehicle beyond repair. But the alternative, staying on the main road where our pursuers could use their superior knowledge of the terrain, seemed even worse. For several minutes, we seemed to be pulling ahead of our pursuers. The lights behind us grew dimmer, and the sounds of pursuit became less distinct. I began to hope that we'd finally manage to shake them, that our random choice of direction had led us away from whatever trap they'd been trying to drive us into. Then we rounded a curve and found ourselves facing a sight that destroyed any remaining hope of escape. Stretched across the road ahead was a makeshift barricade constructed from fallen trees, abandoned vehicles, and coils of razor wire. It was obviously a permanent installation, something that had been built to stop exactly the kind of desperate flight we were attempting. There was no way around it, no way through it, and no time to back up before our pursuers arrived to complete the trap. We were caught. Jake slammed on the brakes and our truck skidded to a stop less than 10 feet from the barricade. In the glare of our headlights, I could see that the obstacle had been constructed with professional efficiency. Multiple layers of barriers were designed to stop vehicles of any size, while the razor wire would prevent anyone from attempting to climb over or crawl through gaps. But it was what lay beyond the barricade that filled me with absolute terror. Standing in the road, illuminated by our headlights, were at least 6 people wearing the same military surplus gear and gas masks we'd seen on the operator of the mechanical prison. They were arranged in a semicircle behind the barricade, each one holding what appeared to be some form of weapon. Improvised clubs, modified tools, devices that had been constructed specifically for subduing human beings without killing them outright. Behind us, the pursuing lights were getting closer rapidly. Within minutes, we'd be surrounded by people who had obviously been hunting human prey in these woods for years. People who had refined their techniques through practice on victims who'd left behind the collection of abandoned vehicles we'd passed earlier. "What do we do?" I asked, though I already knew there were no good options remaining. Jake's hands were shaking as he gripped the steering wheel. I don't know. The engine of the mechanical prison was clearly audible now, accompanied by the sound of multiple other vehicles approaching our position. Our hunters had successfully driven us into a killing ground where escape was impossible and resistance would be futile. But as we sat there in paralyzed terror, waiting for whatever came next, I noticed something that gave me a fragment of hope. To our right, barely visible in the darkness beyond our headlights, was what looked like a footpath leading away from the road. It was too narrow for vehicles, too steep for the mechanical prison, but it might be possible for 2 people to navigate on foot if they were desperate enough to try. "The path," I whispered to Jake. "To the right. We can run." He looked where I was pointing and nodded slowly. "It's our only chance." We agreed on a plan that was simple and probably suicidal. When I gave the signal, Jake would flash our headlights to blind the people behind the barricade. Then we'd throw open our doors and run toward the path. If we were lucky, the sudden light and our unexpected movement would create enough confusion to give us a few seconds head start. If we were unlucky, we'd be captured or killed within yards of our truck. "Ready?" I asked. "Ready," Jake replied, his hand hovering over the headlight switch. I took a deep breath, counted to 3, and shouted, "Now!" Jake flashed the headlights repeatedly while we threw ourselves out of the truck and sprinted toward the barely visible path. Behind us, I could hear shouting and the sound of people climbing over the barricade, but the sudden light had indeed created momentary confusion. The path was even steeper than it had appeared, winding up the side of a rocky slope that would have been challenging to navigate in daylight with proper equipment. In darkness, wearing inadequate footwear and carrying nothing but the clothes on our backs, it was almost impossible. But impossible was better than certain capture. So we climbed. Behind us, the sounds of pursuit were growing fainter as our hunters discovered that their vehicles couldn't follow us up the treacherous slope. But I could hear voices calling back and forth, organizing a search that would probably resume at first light with people on foot who knew the terrain far better than we did. We climbed for what felt like hours, stopping only when exhaustion forced us to rest for a few minutes before continuing upward. Several times, the path seemed to disappear entirely, forcing us to feel our way through loose rock and thorny undergrowth that tore at our clothes and exposed skin. But gradually, the eastern sky began to lighten, and we found ourselves looking down into a valley that contained what appeared to be a legitimate road. Not a hunting trail or a dead-end track, but an actual paved road with occasional traffic moving in both directions. "Civilization," Jake said, and I could hear the tears in his voice. It took us another hour to descend the far side of the slope and reach the road, where we flagged down a passing motorist who agreed to drive us to the nearest town with a police station. By the time we'd given our statements and guided law enforcement back to the area where we'd encountered our hunters, everything had vanished. The barricade was gone, the abandoned vehicles had been removed, and the mechanical prison was nowhere to be found. Even our own truck had disappeared, leaving no evidence that any of the night's events had actually occurred. The police were polite, but skeptical. Our story sounded like the product of exhaustion and imagination, and without physical evidence to support our claims, there was little they could do beyond filing a report that would probably never be investigated further. But I know what we experienced that night was real. Somewhere in the wilderness areas of northern Pennsylvania, people are hunting human beings for sport or profit, or reasons that I don't want to understand. They're using isolated camping areas as traps, luring travelers into situations where escape becomes impossible and help is too far away to matter. The woman by the broken-down truck, the man with the camera, the operator of the mechanical prison, they were all part of an organization that has been perfecting its techniques for years. The collection of abandoned vehicles we glimpsed suggests that many people have fallen victim to their operation, people whose disappearances were probably attributed to getting lost in the wilderness or having accidents on remote roads. Jake and I were lucky. We escaped because we recognized the danger in time and were willing to abandon everything we owned to preserve our lives. But I think about the other travelers who might not be so fortunate. People who trust too easily or hesitate too long when confronted with situations that trigger every primitive alarm their ancestors evolved to keep them alive. I never went camping again. The idea of deliberately placing myself in isolated locations where help is unavailable has lost all appeal. But sometimes, late at night, when sleep proves elusive, I find myself wondering about those hunters. Are they still operating in the same area? Have they refined their techniques further? How many more vehicles have been added to their collection since that night in August 2019? And most disturbing of all, I wonder if what we encountered was an isolated group of predators taking advantage of a remote location, or if similar operations exist in wilderness areas across the country, connected by networks of communication and shared expertise that would make them almost impossible for law enforcement to detect or stop. The forests are vast, and there are so many places where people can disappear without a trace. So many roads that lead nowhere, and so many travelers who trust too easily in the basic decency of strangers they encounter far from the safety of civilization. Some nightmares, I've learned, are too real to wake up from. They follow you home and take up permanent residence in the dark corners of your mind, where they wait patiently for moments of weakness when they can remind you that the world contains horrors that most people never imagine and pray they never encounter. But they're out there. In the forests, in the darkness, waiting for the next unsuspecting travelers who think that isolation equals safety, and that the worst thing that can happen in the wilderness is getting lost or having mechanical trouble with their vehicle. If you ever find yourself on remote roads where cell phones don't work and help is hours away, remember our story. Trust your instincts when situations feel wrong, even if you can't articulate why. Don't let curiosity or the desire to help others override the primitive warnings that have kept our species alive through millennia of avoiding predators that hunt in the dark places of the world. And if you ever encounter a woman standing beside a broken-down truck who smiles at you in a way that makes your skin crawl, don't stop to help. Just drive away as fast as you can and don't look back. Because some people aren't looking for assistance, they're looking for victims. And in the deep wilderness, far from witnesses and rescue, they've learned that victims are surprisingly easy to find among travelers who believe that other people share their basic humanity and moral constraints. That faith in human decency is a beautiful thing, but it can also be deadly when it encounters people who see other human beings as nothing more than prey to be hunted, captured, and collected like trophies in a game that has been played in the shadows for far longer than most of us would care to imagine. The sun came up that morning, as it always does, but it rose on a world that I understood differently than I had the day before. A world where monsters are real, where they hunt in organized groups, and where they've learned to use our own instincts for helping others as weapons against us. I survived because I was lucky, and because Jake was brave enough to take chances that probably should have killed us both. But luck runs out. And bravery isn't always enough when you're facing people who have made hunting human beings their profession. So be careful out there. Be very, very careful. Because they're still out there. Somewhere in the darkness between the trees, waiting for the next travelers who venture too far from safety in search of adventure and solitude. And next time, those travelers might not be as fortunate as we were. I used to be a forestry surveyor back in the 80s, working up in Vuntut National Park in Yukon, Canada. On paper, the job was simple. Map the land, mark the trees, note the changes. But in practice, out there in the wilderness, it was anything but simple. The park stretched over 4,000 square kilometers, a vast expanse of dense forests, jagged ridges, and boggy lowlands that could swallow a person whole without leaving a trace. I'd been at it for nearly 15 years by that point, becoming intimately familiar with the terrain's moods and secrets. At 42, I was leaner than most men my age, hardened by years of solitary treks through some of North America's most unforgiving landscapes. What drew me to this work wasn't the pay, which was modest at best. It was the solitude, the profound silence that settled around you after days without human contact. The knowledge that for miles in every direction, you were utterly alone with your thoughts and the ancient trees. Some found this terrifying. I found it cleansing. In late September of 1985, I ventured deeper into the interior than I'd ever gone before. My supervisor had requested detailed surveys of an area that hadn't been properly documented since the 1960s. The nearest road was a 4-day hike away, and the ranger station was even further. My pack weighed nearly 60 pounds, loaded with enough supplies for 2 weeks, dehydrated food, water purification tablets, mapping equipment, a first aid kit, and my camera. The first 3 days passed without incident. I woke each morning before dawn, broke camp, and hiked until dusk, stopping only to record measurements or photograph notable features. My journal entries from those days were methodical, precise, the observations of a man comfortable in his routine. Day 3. Mapped eastern tributary of Caribou Creek. Elevation gain of approximately 210 meters over 3 kilometers. Evidence of beaver activity increasing. Weather clear, temperature dropping to near freezing at night. I remember how the air smelled on that third evening. Crisp pine mingled with the earthy scent of decaying leaves. I built a small fire, heated my dinner, and fell asleep to the distant howling of wolves. It would be the last normal night I would experience for a very long time. The morning of the fourth day brought heavy fog that clung to the valleys and wound between trees like spectral fingers. I broke camp later than usual, waiting for visibility to improve. By mid-morning, the fog had thinned enough for me to continue northward, following a drainage line I needed to plot for the survey. The forest grew denser as I hiked, the spruce and pine closing in around me until branches scraped against my pack from both sides. I had to duck and weave through the undergrowth, my boots sinking into a carpet of moss and rotting vegetation that muffled my footsteps. Around noon, I noticed something strange ahead. The trees weren't standing right. They were tilted, leaning outward as if pushed by some powerful force. I stopped, adjusted my pack, and squinted through the branches. Beyond them was a clearing, a perfect circle punched into the forest canopy. Curiosity overrode caution. I pressed forward, my boots sinking slightly into the increasingly soft earth. As I reached the edge of the tree line, I froze. Everything within that circle, the trees, the shrubs, even the dirt itself, was bleached an ashy white. Not burned, not frosted, but drained of color. The trees stood like bone sculptures, their bark peeling in dry, powdery flakes. The ground crunched beneath my boots, brittle and desiccated. In 15 years of forestry work, I'd seen plenty. Fire scars, beetle kills, flood damage, the aftermath of bears tearing through campsites. This was different. This was wrong in a way I couldn't articulate. I moved forward, drawn toward the center despite the growing unease in my gut. There in the middle of it all was a crater. Small, perhaps 3 feet wide and 2 feet deep, little more than a shallow depression in the white earth. I stood over it, staring down. There was no meteorite, no rocks, no sign of what had made it. Just an empty hole. The air was unnaturally still. No birds called, no insects buzzed. No wind rustled through the bleached remnants of foliage. The silence pressed against my eardrums until I could hear my own heartbeat. I felt watched, though I knew I was alone. Something about that spot made my skin tighten, like I was being observed by unseen, unfriendly eyes. I shifted my weight, the sound of my boots on the white soil jarringly loud in the silence. Despite my discomfort, professional habit took over. I needed to document this. I dropped my pack and pulled out my analog camera. My hands trembled as I fumbled with the lens cap, but I managed to line up several shots. Wide angles of the blasted trees, panoramas of the white expanse, close-ups of the crater itself. The mechanical click of the shutter seemed to echo in the unnatural quiet. I took at least a dozen photographs, growing more unsettled with each exposure. This wasn't just another routine log entry. This was something my supervisors needed to see, something scientists would want to investigate. Once the roll of film was exhausted, I packed the camera away, slung my bag over my shoulder, and began the trek back, relieved to be leaving that place behind. The walk away from the white clearing was a long one. I'd planned to make camp that night and continue my survey the next day, but after encountering that strange sight, I wanted solid walls around me. I decided to push through, hiking all the way back to the ranger station if necessary. For the first 2 hours, everything seemed normal. There was just the usual ache in my shoulders from the weight of my pack, and the familiar burn in my thighs from navigating the uneven terrain. Then the headache started. At first, it was just a dull throb behind my eyes. I attributed it to strain, maybe dehydration, so I stopped and drank deeply from my canteen. The water, usually refreshing, tasted flat and did nothing to ease the growing pressure in my skull. By the 3-hour mark, my stomach had joined the revolt, a nauseating twist that grew sharper with each step. Sweat poured down my face despite the cool afternoon air. My vision began to blur at the edges, objects doubling and swimming before me. When I reached the final ridge before the ranger station, I had to stop. Leaning against a tree, I tried to catch my breath. My heart raced too fast, pounding against my ribs like it wanted to escape. When I wiped my brow, my hand came away red. My nose was bleeding. Then the vomiting hit. It came without warning. A violent, convulsive heave that left me on all fours in the dirt. The contents of my stomach splattered against the forest floor, strangely dark and viscous. I spat, trying to clear the bitter taste from my mouth, and realized with growing horror that something was very wrong with me. I don't remember reaching the ranger station. Fragments remain. The crunch of gravel under my boots, the sudden glare of electric lights, a man's voice raised in alarm. The ranger on duty, I think his name was Howard, took one look at me and lunged for the radio. I caught phrases through the buzzing in my ears: medical emergency and immediate evacuation. I collapsed before he finished the call, my legs simply giving out beneath me. The floor rushed up to meet me, and I vomited again. Only this time, the liquid that spilled from my mouth was streaked with what looked like dark fibers. Howard rushed to my side, his face swimming in and out of focus above me. "What happened to you out there?" he asked, pressing a cool cloth to my forehead. I tried to tell him about the white clearing, the crater, the feeling of being watched. The words slurred together, making no sense even to my own ears. Then darkness swept in, and I remember nothing more. I woke to the rhythmic beeping of machines and the antiseptic smell of a hospital room. Harsh fluorescent lights burned my eyes when I tried to open them. An IV line snaked into my arm, the needle site sore and bruised. My throat felt raw, as if I'd been screaming. A nurse noticed I was conscious. She approached cautiously, her face partially hidden behind a surgical mask. "You're awake," she said, her voice professional, but warm. "How are you feeling?" I tried to speak, but produced only a dry croak. She held a cup of water to my lips, and I sipped gratefully. The liquid stung going down. "What happened to me?" I managed after several attempts. "The doctor will explain," she replied, checking the monitors beside my bed. "He'll be in shortly." Time stretched bizarrely in that sterile room. Minutes seemed like hours as I drifted in and out of consciousness. When the doctor finally arrived, I was lucid enough to focus on his face. Thin, serious, with steel-rimmed glasses that caught the light as he moved. "You gave everyone quite a scare," he said, consulting a clipboard. "The paramedics thought you might not make it." "How long have I been here?" My voice sounded strange to my own ears, hollow and distant. 3 days. You've been in and out." He pulled up a chair beside the bed. "What do you remember about what happened before you got sick?" I told him about the white clearing, the crater, the bleached trees. His expression didn't change, but he made notes on his clipboard. When I finished, he nodded slowly. "Your symptoms are consistent with acute toxic exposure," he explained. "Severe nausea, fever, neurological effects, bleeding from mucous membranes. We've ruled out common pathogens. No signs of viral or bacterial infection." "Then what caused it?" He hesitated. "Our working theory is some kind of environmental toxin. A fungal agent, perhaps, or chemical contamination. The Federal Environmental Agency has been notified. They'll want to speak with you once you're stronger. My camera, I said suddenly, remembering. I took pictures. They'll show what I found. Your equipment is with your personal effects. He gestured to a cabinet across the room. I'll have the nurse bring it to you later. He stood to leave, then paused. One more thing. During your delirium, you kept talking about being watched. You said they're in the trees and they're listening. Do you remember any of that? I shook my head, a chill washing over me despite the hospital room's warmth. Not unusual with high fevers, he assured me. Rest now. We'll talk more tomorrow. After he left, I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, trying to piece together the fragmented memories of my ordeal. I could recall the white clearing perfectly, but everything after leaving it was a jumble of confused images and sensations. One thought kept returning. What if it wasn't a toxin? What if it was something else entirely? Something the doctors couldn't identify because they didn't know to look for it. In the darkness of that hospital room, the thought seemed less ridiculous than it should have. I was discharged after 8 days, still weak but stable enough to leave. The doctors had found no permanent damage, though they warned me that some symptoms, fatigue, occasional headaches, vivid dreams, might persist for weeks or months. My first stop was the Forestry Service headquarters. I needed to report what I'd found and deliver the photographic evidence. I was anxious, but also eager. Those photos would validate my experience, prove that I hadn't imagined or hallucinated the white clearing. My supervisor, a stern woman named Jacobs, listened to my account without interruption. Her face remained impassive as I described the bleached circle, the empty crater, the unnatural silence. When I finished, she asked a few perfunctory questions about the exact location, then suggested we develop the film immediately. The technician took my camera into the darkroom. Jacobs and I waited in strained silence, she clearly skeptical, I increasingly nervous. After what seemed an eternity, the technician emerged with a stack of prints. My heart sank as he spread them across the table. Every shot of the impact site was nothing but a white, fuzzy blur. Not overexposed, not underexposed, just a static mess of nothingness. The other photos from earlier in my trip were perfectly clear. Only those of the white clearing were ruined. Could be light damage, the technician suggested, avoiding my eyes. Or moisture got into the camera. Jacobs examined the blurred images, her expression hardening. Well, she said finally, these don't tell us much. But I saw it, I insisted, hearing the desperation in my voice. It was real. Something happened out there. I'm not saying it didn't, she replied carefully. But without evidence, there's not much we can do. You've been through a traumatic experience. Maybe once you've had some rest. I don't need rest, I interrupted. I need someone to investigate that site. Something there made me sick. The Environmental Agency found nothing unusual in your blood work, she reminded me. Their official position is that you likely encountered a naturally occurring toxin, a mushroom perhaps, or plant sap that caused a severe allergic reaction. I stared at her, incredulous. Then why did the photos turn out like this? Just these specific photos? She sighed. Technical glitch, bad film, coincidence. There are many possible explanations. The conversation ended there. Jacobs advised me to take 2 weeks of sick leave before returning to work. No one outright accused me of fabricating the story, but I felt the weight of their disbelief. In their eyes, I was a reliable surveyor who'd had a breakdown in the wilderness, an occupational hazard they'd seen before. Without proof, my words alone couldn't convince them. And each time I tried to explain how the timing didn't fit, how I'd been fine until after leaving the impact site, I could see them mentally filing my protestations under symptoms of trauma. Eventually, I stopped talking about it. Not because I doubted what I'd seen, but because I realized no one would believe me without evidence. And the evidence somehow had been erased. I returned to work after 3 weeks, determined to put the incident behind me. I took assignments closer to headquarters, shorter trips that kept me within radio contact. My colleagues were supportive in that awkward way people treat someone they believe has suffered a psychological break. They spoke carefully around me, avoided certain topics, and exchanged glances when they thought I wasn't looking. For several months, I maintained the facade of recovery. I filed my reports, attended staff meetings, shared casual conversations in the break room. To all outward appearances, I had moved on from my wilderness episode, as one coworker tactfully called it. But I hadn't moved on. I couldn't. The white clearing haunted my dreams and invaded my waking thoughts. I began keeping a private journal, recording every detail I could remember about the site, drawing maps and diagrams, trying to pinpoint its exact location. The official coordinates I'd logged that day led nowhere. The GPS data showed me in an unremarkable section of forest when I claimed to have discovered the crater. In the spring of 1986, I requested a return to deep forest surveys. Jacobs was reluctant, but eventually agreed, perhaps believing that facing my fears would help me fully recover. I set out with a new camera, extra rolls of film, and a personal GPS unit I'd purchased with my own money. For 2 weeks, I followed my original route, comparing my current position to the maps I'd drawn from memory. The forest looked the same. Endless stretches of spruce and pine, moss-covered ground, the occasional clearing created by fallen trees. Nothing white, nothing dead, nothing unusual. On the 10th day, as I was about to give up, I found something. Not the clearing itself, but a patch of forest where the trees grew at strange angles, leaning away from a central point as if repelled by something. The undergrowth was thinner here, the ground cover sparse. My heart racing, I pushed forward, certain I was approaching the white crater. The trees thinned further and I glimpsed an open space ahead. But when I broke through into the clearing, disappointment crashed over me. It was just an ordinary meadow, lush with spring vegetation, wildflowers nodding in the gentle breeze. I searched the entire area, looking for any sign of the white desolation I remembered. Nothing. I took photos anyway, marking the location precisely in my journal. When the film was developed, the pictures showed exactly what I'd seen. A perfectly normal mountain meadow. Over the next year, I made 3 more attempts to locate the white clearing, each more desperate than the last. I searched increasingly remote areas, venturing into sections of the park rarely visited even by experienced rangers. I found nothing. My obsession didn't go unnoticed. Jacobs called me into her office after my 4th failed expedition. "This has to stop," she said, her concern evident. "You're one of our best surveyors, but I'm worried about you. This fixation isn't healthy." I tried to explain that I needed answers, needed to understand what had happened to me. She listened patiently, then slid a business card across her desk. It belonged to a psychologist who specialized in trauma and stress disorders. "Just talk to him," she urged. "Please." I took the card, but never made the appointment. No therapist would believe me either. Instead, I did what Jacobs wanted. I stopped searching, at least officially. Years passed. I remained with the Forestry Service, earning promotions and commendations for my work. The incident became a footnote in my personnel file, rarely mentioned and generally forgotten by everyone except me. I never stopped watching, though. Every trip into the backcountry, every survey, every hike became an opportunity to scan the horizon for that telltale white glow among the trees. I became known for my thorough documentation, my insistence on photographing even mundane features of the landscape. If my colleagues thought it odd, they attributed it to the perfectionism that had earned me professional respect. The physical effects of my illness lingered. Headaches came and went, especially during changes in the weather. Occasionally, I would wake drenched in sweat, fragments of disturbing dreams clinging to my consciousness. Dreams of white trees and empty craters and eyes watching from the shadows. In the fall of 1992, 7 years after my encounter, a new surveyor joined our team. A young woman fresh from forestry school, eager and idealistic. During her orientation hike, as we cataloged tree species in a remote valley, she suddenly stopped and pointed to a stand of pines on a distant ridge. "What's that white patch up there?" she asked. I followed her gaze, blood rushing in my ears. There, barely visible through the trees, was a splash of pale color that didn't belong in the autumn forest. I started toward it immediately, ignoring her confused questions, my heart hammering against my ribs. We never reached it. A storm moved in with unexpected speed, forcing us to abandon the hike and return to base. By the time weather conditions improved 3 days later, I couldn't find the white patch again, no matter how carefully I searched the area. The new surveyor, confused by my intensity, eventually decided she must have been mistaken. Perhaps it was just an unusual rock formation catching the light in a particular way. But I knew better. It had been there, and then it wasn't. Just like before. That incident rekindled my determination. I began researching similar phenomena, spending evenings in the university library in Whitehorse, poring over scientific journals and environmental reports. I learned about fungal infections that could bleach vegetation, about soil contamination from industrial chemicals, about the effects of radiation on plant life. None quite matched what I had seen, but they gave me a vocabulary to frame my experience in more credible terms. I wrote to researchers at environmental agencies describing unusual vegetation discoloration I'd observed in the park. Most ignored me. Those who responded suggested mundane explanations: alkaline soil deposits, localized frost damage, even droppings from migratory birds that could temporarily change soil chemistry. In 1994, I came across a newspaper article about unexplained dead zones discovered in remote forests in Oregon. The description, circular areas where vegetation had died and turned white, matched my experience so closely that my hands shook as I read. I contacted the journalist immediately, but by the time she responded weeks later, the story had developed. The dead zones had been conclusively linked to illegal chemical dumping by a logging company. Mystery solved. Case closed. Except I knew that no one had been dumping chemicals in the heart of Vuntut National Park, hundreds of miles from the nearest road. I retired from the Forestry Service in 2001 at age 58. My knees couldn't handle the rigorous hikes anymore, and the younger surveyors had technology I barely understood. Satellite imagery, digital mapping systems, handheld computers that made my methods seem like ancient history. I bought a small house outside Whitehorse, close enough to civilization for convenience, but far enough into the woods to satisfy my need for solitude. My days fell into a quiet rhythm: morning coffee on the porch, afternoons tending my garden or fishing in the nearby creek, evenings with books or the occasional visitor from my forestry days. The nightmares grew less frequent as the years passed. The headaches subsided. I began to wonder if perhaps Jacobs and the doctors had been right all along. Maybe I had stumbled upon some natural toxin that affected both my health and my perception. Maybe the white clearing had been a hallucination, a waking dream produced by a fevered mind. Then the letters started arriving. The first came in the winter of 2005, a plain envelope with no return address. Inside was a single sheet of paper containing a brief typewritten message. "I found your white circle. Northern Saskatchewan. Same sickness afterward. Did your photos blur too?" I stared at those words for a long time, my hands trembling. There was a phone number at the bottom. I dialed it immediately, but it had been disconnected. Over the next 3 years, 4 more letters arrived, each from a different person, each describing an encounter eerily similar to mine. A hunter in British Columbia. A geologist in the Northwest Territories. a pilot who spotted a white circle from the air while flying over remote parts of Alaska, a hiker in Montana. All described the same features: the perfect circle of white vegetation, the small crater at the center, the unnatural silence. All reported becoming violently ill afterward. All mentioned photographs that somehow failed to capture what they had seen, coming out blurred, overexposed, or containing nothing but static. I created a map, marking each reported location with a red pin. When I connected the points, they formed no recognizable pattern. The circles appeared randomly distributed across the northwestern part of the continent, with hundreds of miles between them. In 2010, I received a different kind of letter, this one from a physicist at a university in Vancouver. He had been forwarded my correspondence by the geologist who had written to me earlier. His message was brief and cautious, but it sent a chill through me. The phenomena you describe bears certain similarities to theoretical models of localized space-time anomalies. I would be interested in discussing your observations in greater detail, particularly the effect on photographic equipment and the subsequent illness you experienced. Please contact me at your earliest convenience. I never responded. Not because I wasn't intrigued, but because at 72 I had finally found a measure of peace. The white clearing had dominated my thoughts for decades. I had sacrificed relationships, opportunities, and countless hours to my obsession with understanding what had happened to me that day in the forest. And what had it brought me? More questions, more uncertainty, more sleepless nights. Sometimes I think mysteries are meant to remain unsolved. I still have those blurry photographs stored in an envelope in my desk drawer. Occasionally, I take them out and examine them, searching for any detail I might have missed, any clue hidden in the white static. There's never anything new to see, yet I keep looking. My hands shake worse now than they did back then. My knees protest loudly when I climb the stairs to my bedroom. But my mind remains clear, and the memory of that day in 1985 has not faded in the slightest. Was it radiation from some secret government test? A natural phenomenon science has yet to explain? Something else entirely? Something beyond our current understanding of the world? I don't know. I probably never will. But I'm certain of one thing. If I ever see that white glow between the trees again, I'm walking straight the other way. The camping trip had been circled on my calendar for weeks, a small reprieve from the overwhelming demands of adult life. As I packed my gear on that crisp October morning in 2023, I felt the stress of the previous months beginning to dissolve. At 34, these escapes into nature had become increasingly precious, rare opportunities to disconnect and remember what genuinely mattered. Jason, Kevin, and I had planned meticulously, though not extravagantly. Our destination was a remote section of Tennessee wilderness, far from designated campgrounds or hiking trails, the kind of place where cell service disappeared and modern conveniences became distant memories. The three of us had been organizing these excursions since our college days, though our responsibilities had made them increasingly infrequent. "Everything packed?" my wife asked, leaning against the doorframe as I loaded the final supplies into my weathered backpack. "I believe so," I replied, mentally checking off essentials. Just a simple overnight: tent, sleeping bag, food, and enough beer to ensure good conversation. She smiled, but I noticed the subtle concern in her eyes. "Just be careful out there. The weather forecast mentioned potential storms." I nodded reassuringly. "We'll be fine. Jason checked the radar this morning. Any precipitation should miss us by at least 50 miles. The drive to our meeting point took nearly an hour, winding through progressively narrower roads until civilization seemed to recede in my rearview mirror. Jason's truck was already parked at our designated spot, and Kevin pulled in moments after I arrived. "Ready for some proper isolation?" Jason grinned as we transferred our gear to his vehicle for the final leg of the journey. His enthusiasm was infectious, always had been since our freshman year roommate days. Kevin, characteristically more reserved, methodically checked his equipment. Map shows the spot about 7 miles up this Forest Service road. Should be perfect. No registered campsites for at least 3 miles in any direction. The implications of that isolation hadn't yet registered as we bounced along the deteriorating dirt road, laughing and recounting stories from previous adventures. The forest grew increasingly dense around us, ancient trees blocking out significant portions of daylight and creating an enclosed corridor that seemed to swallow us whole. None of us recognized the unsettling weight of that seclusion yet. The woods watched our intrusion with patient interest as we drove deeper into their domain, unaware that we were leaving safety far behind us. The Forest Service road eventually deteriorated into little more than a rough trail, forcing Jason to navigate with extreme caution to avoid damaging his vehicle's undercarriage. Massive tree roots had erupted through the soil, creating natural obstacles that required our full attention. The thick canopy above filtered the afternoon sunlight into dappled patterns that shifted eerily across the dashboard. "Should be just ahead," Kevin announced, consulting the GPS coordinates he'd marked before losing signal entirely. "There's supposed to be a small clearing near a seasonal creek." When we finally reached our destination, the area appeared perfect, almost suspiciously so. A natural opening in the dense forest created a roughly circular clearing approximately 30 yards in diameter. The remnants of a fire ring indicated previous human presence, though it appeared long abandoned. "Someone's been here before," I observed, kneeling to examine the old charcoal remains. "But not recently." Jason shrugged, already unloading equipment from the truck. "That's reassuring, actually. Means it's a good spot. Let's set up before we lose more daylight." We fell into our well-established routine. Kevin assembled the tent, Jason gathered firewood, and I unpacked our supplies and prepared the cooking area. The efficiency of long practice had us fully established within an hour. As evening approached, we concentrated on building a substantial fire. October nights in these mountains could drop to near freezing temperatures. The flames provided welcome warmth as darkness enveloped the forest. We positioned our camp chairs in a semicircle, cracked open our first beers, and settled into the comfortable familiarity of long-established friendship. Stars gradually appeared overhead, more numerous and brilliant than anything visible near the light pollution of our everyday lives. "Remember our first trip out here?" Jason asked, stoking the fire with a long branch. "Senior year, when we got completely lost because Kevin insisted he could navigate without a map?" Kevin laughed, accepting the mockery with good nature. "We were only lost for 3 hours. Besides, we found that abandoned hunter's cabin. That was worth the detour." The conversation flowed naturally, punctuated by the crackling fire and occasional distant wildlife sounds. We reminisced about previous adventures, shared updates on career developments, and avoided discussing the increasingly complicated aspects of our adult lives. The isolation felt therapeutic rather than threatening, a deliberate disconnect from responsibilities and expectations. As midnight approached, the temperature dropped significantly. We added the last substantial logs to the fire and retreated to our tent, arranging our sleeping bags in the familiar configuration. The forest had grown strangely quiet, I realized. No owls, no rustling vegetation, no scurrying nocturnal creatures. Just absolute stillness interrupted only by our own movements. "Unusually quiet tonight," I remarked as we settled in. "Always is this deep in," Jason replied through a yawn. "One of the reasons I love it out here." Within minutes, their breathing had slowed into the rhythm of sleep. I lay awake slightly longer, listening to the profound silence and watching shadowy tree branches create abstract patterns on the tent fabric. When sleep finally claimed me, it was deep and dreamless. Morning arrived with diffused gray light filtering through the tent walls. I blinked awake, momentarily disoriented by the unfamiliar surroundings, before remembering where we were. Jason and Kevin remained motionless in their sleeping bags, their breathing deep and regular. My watch displayed 6:17 a.m., earlier than I typically rose, but normal during these outdoor excursions, when artificial light no longer dictated our schedules. The temperature had dropped considerably overnight. My breath formed visible clouds as I carefully extracted myself from my sleeping bag, trying not to disturb my companions. The fire had reduced to faintly glowing embers, barely radiating any heat. I shivered, pulling on an additional layer before unzipping the tent entrance. Outside, the forest remained wrapped in early morning stillness. A thin layer of ground fog hovered between the trees, creating an ethereal boundary between earth and air. Dew had accumulated on every surface, transforming spiderwebs into intricate crystal structures between branches. The beauty of it momentarily captured my attention. Nature's delicate artistry displayed without human interference. My immediate priority was restarting the fire and preparing coffee. I recalled seeing the coffee pot in Jason's truck the previous evening, so I headed toward the vehicle, my boots leaving distinct impressions in the dew-dampened earth. The truck was parked approximately 20 yards from our tent, partially obscured by a stand of young pine trees. As I approached, something about the vehicle's silhouette seemed wrong, different from how we'd left it. At first, I thought perhaps an animal had disturbed our supplies, but the modification appeared too deliberate, too intentional. Drawing closer, confusion transformed into horrified comprehension. Stretched meticulously across the hood of Jason's truck was what appeared to be an animal skin, completely flattened and displayed with unmistakable purposefulness. The fur had been methodically removed, leaving only the inner dermal layer exposed, raw, pink, and glistening with moisture. Dark crimson streaks extended down the windshield in precisely parallel lines, some still wet enough to reflect the gray morning light. I froze, unable to process what I was seeing. The skin had been positioned with careful deliberation, centered perfectly on the hood, corners aligned with the vehicle's edges. This wasn't random animal activity or a natural occurrence. This was a message, created by human hands with frightening precision. The skin itself proved difficult to identify. The proportions suggested deer, but the absence of the head and limbs, evidently removed with crude cutting implements, obscured definitive identification. What remained was approximately 4 feet in length and nearly as wide, fastidiously stretched to maximize surface area. The edges appeared jagged and irregular, suggesting hurried or inexperienced butchery. The odor registered next, a powerful, nauseating combination of raw meat, copper-scented blood, and something more troubling beneath those expected smells, a sickly sweet note of early decomposition. The stench triggered an involuntary gag reflex that I struggled to suppress. Instinctively, I scanned the surrounding forest, suddenly acutely aware of our vulnerability. The trees stood as impassive witnesses, revealing nothing. No movement caught my eye, no sound betrayed another presence, yet the undeniable evidence of human activity during the night transformed the previously benign wilderness into something immediately threatening. I needed to wake Jason and Kevin. We needed to leave. "Jason! Kevin!" I called urgently, retreating backward toward the tent while maintaining visual contact with the surrounding forest. "You need to see this." The desperation in my voice achieved the desired effect. Within seconds, the tent rustled with movement, followed by Jason's sleepy voice. "What's happening?" "Just get out here," I insisted, unwilling to articulate what I'd discovered. They emerged moments later, initially confused and irritated at the abrupt awakening. Kevin rubbed his eyes, squinting against the morning light. "What's got you so—" His words terminated abruptly as he followed my gaze to the truck. Jason emerged behind him, his expression transitioning from annoyance to shock as comprehension dawned. "What the actual—" Jason approached cautiously, as though the displayed skin might somehow animate. "Is that—" "Some kind of animal skin," I confirmed. "Deliberately placed during the night." Kevin remained frozen, his complexion visibly paling. Someone was here while we slept. The statement hung between us, weighted with implications none of us wanted to confront. A subtle snap of a twig from somewhere within the forest perimeter accelerated our decision-making process. Without verbal agreement, we began dismantling our campsite with unprecedented efficiency. The tent collapsed haphazardly into its storage bag, cooking equipment clattered into containers without being cleaned, sleeping bags were stuffed rather than rolled. What about that? Kevin nodded toward the skins still adorning the truck's hood. Jason retrieved a fallen branch from nearby, using it to push the grotesque display off his vehicle. It slid reluctantly, leaving smeared trails of blood and tissue before landing on the ground with a disturbingly substantial sound. None of us looked at it directly again. Within 12 minutes, a new record for decamping, we had loaded everything into the truck. Jason started the engine, its mechanical rumble unnaturally loud in the pristine morning silence. As we pulled away, I obsessively monitored the forest behind us through the rear window, convinced I would glimpse whoever had delivered this warning. The forest revealed nothing but endless trees gradually obscured by our vehicle's dust cloud. Yet the sensation of being observed persisted with uncomfortable intensity. Anyone want to explain what just happened? Kevin finally broke the silence as we navigated the rough forest road, Jason driving with significantly more speed than prudence warranted. Someone skinned an animal and put it on the truck, Jason stated, his knuckles white from gripping the steering wheel too forcefully. While we were sleeping. But why? Kevin pressed. What's the point? A warning, I suggested, the idea materializing in my consciousness without conscious development. A message that we weren't welcome. We lapsed into uncomfortable silence after that, each processing the implications differently. The truck bounced violently over exposed roots and depressions, but nobody suggested reducing speed. Physical discomfort seemed trivial compared to the psychological unease permeating the vehicle. When we finally reached paved road approximately 40 minutes later, a collective exhalation of relief escaped us. Civilization, even in this limited form of rural infrastructure, provided illusory security. We maintained our silence for several more miles before Kevin spoke again. Should we report this? To the police or Forest Service? Jason considered this briefly. And tell them what? Someone left an animal skin on my truck? They'd ask if anything was stolen or damaged. It was a threat, I insisted. Deliberate intimidation. Maybe, Jason conceded. Or maybe just some local hunters messing with outsiders. Either way, we're not going back. We parted ways at our original meeting point with minimal conversation, transferring our gear to our respective vehicles mechanically. The unspoken agreement was clear. We would process this independently before discussing it further. I watched my friends' vehicles disappear in opposite directions, then sat motionless in my car, hands trembling slightly against the steering wheel. The rational explanation, local hunters or pranksters, failed to resolve my growing unease. Something about the meticulous positioning, the deliberate skinning, suggested purpose beyond simple intimidation. It felt personal, specific, though I couldn't articulate why. The drive home passed in a dissociative blur. Familiar landmarks registered without emotional connection as my mind continuously replayed the morning's discovery. By the time I pulled into my driveway, the gore-streaked truck hood had imprinted itself permanently in my memory, a visceral image that resisted displacement. My wife greeted me with evident surprise. "You're back early. Everything okay?" I manufactured a plausible explanation about deteriorating weather forecasts, unwilling to burden her with the actual circumstances. She accepted this without question, though her expression suggested she sensed the underlying falseness of my account. After unloading my equipment, I immediately turned my attention to my vehicle. Though no blood had touched its surface, I felt compelled to wash it thoroughly, as though contamination might have transferred merely through proximity. I directed the hose with obsessive attention to detail. watching pink-tinged water stream down the driveway until it ran clear. That evening, restlessness drove me to my computer. Initial searches for animal skin left on vehicle and hunting intimidation tactics yielded surprisingly relevant results. I discovered similar incidents documented across rural America, skinned animals left as warnings, territorial markers, or threats. Most accounts attributed these acts to territorial hunters, protectionist landowners, or local youth engaging in extreme hazing of outsiders. One forum thread particularly captured my attention. A user from eastern Kentucky described finding a perfectly skinned raccoon displayed across their tent while camping in an unmarked area. The subsequent discussion included dozens of similar accounts, spanning decades and multiple states throughout Appalachia and the deeper South. A user identifying as a former Forest Service employee offered historical context. These incidents have occurred for generations in certain remote communities. Originally intended as territorial warnings to encroaching outsiders, they evolved into regional folklore. Many perpetrators today are simply replicating behaviors they've heard about without understanding the original purpose. This rational explanation provided temporary comfort, but failed to address the disquieting precision of our experience. Territorial warnings typically involved simpler methods: slashed tires, equipment theft, verbal confrontations. The methodical skinning and careful display suggested ritualistic elements that commercial hunting practices couldn't explain. Sleep evaded me that night. Each time I approached unconsciousness, my mind projected the image of that glistening skin onto my closed eyelids. I found myself listening intently to normal house settling sounds, reinterpreting them as potential intrusions. Around 3 a.m., I relocated to the living room couch, unwilling to disturb my wife with my restlessness. Morning arrived with crushing fatigue but no resolution. I contacted Jason and Kevin individually, discovering they had experienced similar sleep disruption. We agreed to meet that evening to discuss the incident properly. The abbreviated conversation during our hasty departure had left too many aspects unaddressed. The local diner provided neutral territory, its brightly lit interior and continuous background conversation creating an environment antithetical to our unsettling experience. Kevin arrived first, the dark circles beneath his eyes mirroring my own. Jason joined shortly after, his typically animated demeanor noticeably subdued. "I've been researching," I began after we'd ordered coffee. "Apparently this isn't uncommon in remote areas. Some kind of territorial marking or warning system." Jason nodded. "I spoke with my uncle who used to hunt in those mountains. He's heard stories. Locals leaving skinned animals for people who camp where they shouldn't." "That's supposed to make us feel better?" Kevin questioned. "That someone deliberately targeted us for camping in their hunting grounds?" "Better than the alternatives," Jason replied. The unspoken alternatives hung between us, implications too disturbing to articulate directly. We maintained conversation for nearly 2 hours, analyzing every aspect of the experience without reaching satisfying conclusions. The factual elements were clear. Someone had approached our campsite during the night, deposited a freshly skinned animal carcass on Jason's truck with deliberate care, and departed without disturbing us. The motivation and identity of this individual remained entirely speculative. "I'm not going back out there," Kevin eventually stated with finality. "Not this season, maybe not ever." Neither Jason nor I contested this declaration. The violation of our perceived security had fundamentally altered our relationship with the wilderness. What had previously represented escape and freedom now carried undertones of vulnerability and threat. The following week brought no resolution, only increasing preoccupation. The incident contaminated my daily activities. Unexpected sounds triggered disproportionate startle responses, and periods of darkness induced irrational vigilance. I found myself checking window locks repeatedly before bedtime and installing additional exterior lighting around my home. My wife eventually confronted me about these behavioral changes. "Something happened on that trip that you're not telling me," she stated one evening. her tone indicating this wasn't a question. I hesitated briefly before describing the actual events. Her expression transformed from concern to alarm as I recounted discovering the skin, our hasty departure, and the subsequent research that provided limited context. "You need to report this," she insisted immediately. "That's threatening behavior." "The sheriff's department won't take it seriously," I countered. "No property damage, no explicit threat. They'll file a report and forget about it." Despite my reluctance, her insistence eventually prevailed. The following morning, I contacted the county sheriff's office with jurisdiction over the area where we'd camped. The dispatcher connected me with Deputy Wilson, who listened to my account with professional detachment. "Location?" he requested after I'd finished. I provided approximate coordinates based on our GPS records. "That's Jenkins' property," he remarked after consulting something on his end. "About 800 acres of private forest bordering state land. They allow hunting but not camping." This revelation introduced a new dimension. "We thought it was national forest land. There weren't any posting signs." "Property boundaries out there aren't always clearly marked," Deputy Wilson acknowledged. "The Jenkins family has owned that land for generations. They're particular about trespassers." "Particular enough to leave skinned animals as warnings?" A brief silence preceded his response. "I can't speak to specific tactics, sir. I'll document your report and speak with the property owners about appropriate signage." His tone conveyed clear dismissal. This wasn't a priority concern for rural law enforcement. I pressed further, asking whether similar incidents had been reported previously. "Nothing officially documented," he replied carefully. "But these areas have their own ways of handling outsiders. My recommendation would be to stick to designated camping areas in the future." The conversation provided minimal satisfaction, but confirmed my suspicion that such incidents weren't unprecedented. The Jenkins name offered a concrete entity responsible for the territory, though whether family members themselves had delivered the warning remained unclear. Further online research revealed scattered information about the Jenkins family, regional landowners since the early 1900s, primarily engaged in sustainable timber harvesting and licensed hunting leases. Nothing suggested particular hostility toward outsiders, though several forum posts mentioned their reputation for privacy and territorial protection. A local history website referenced the family's involvement in traditional forest management practices and preservation of regional customs, vague terminology that could encompass virtually any behavior. One archived newspaper article from 1987 described a dispute between Jenkins family representatives and state conservation officials regarding hunting practices, though specific details remained ambiguous. I located 7 additional accounts of skinned animals left as warnings throughout the region, spanning from 1975 to 2020. Most described similar circumstances: remote camping locations, no direct human contact, precisely positioned animal remains discovered in the morning. The consistency across decades suggested established practice rather than random intimidation. A message from Kevin interrupted my research. "Started feeling watched at home. Installed security cameras yesterday. Am I going crazy?" The message resonated uncomfortably with my own experience. Since returning, I'd frequently sensed observation without visible cause. A perception I'd attributed to anxiety rather than legitimate threat. Kevin's independent development of similar paranoia suggested something beyond coincidental stress response. "Not crazy," I responded. "Same here. Jason too?" "Called him yesterday. He's keeping a baseball bat beside his bed." The implication disturbed me profoundly. All 3 of us, rational, educated adults, had independently developed paranoid behaviors following our experience. This collective response suggested legitimate trauma rather than individual overreaction. More troubling was the underlying question: what exactly were we afraid of? Territorial hunters would have achieved their objective. We had vacated their land with no intention of returning. Any rational threat had ended with our departure. Yet something about the experience had triggered deeper instinctual responses. awakening primitive fears that modern rationality failed to dismiss. 2 weeks after the incident, unusual occurrences began accumulating around my home. Initially subtle enough to dismiss individually, their collective pattern became increasingly difficult to rationalize. Small items relocated between rooms without explanation. Exterior motion detector lights activated without visible triggers. Unexplained scratching sounds emanated from the attic space during pre-dawn hours. My wife noticed my deteriorating mental state, but attributed it to work-related stress rather than connecting it to the camping incident. Her concern manifested as increased patience rather than shared vigilance, creating an isolation that intensified my unease. I couldn't articulate why seemingly minor domestic anomalies triggered such disproportionate anxiety. Jason reported similar experiences during our increasingly frequent phone conversations. "Something was in my garage last night," he confided one evening, voice lowered despite being alone in his home. Nothing taken, nothing damaged, but things moved. Tools rearranged on the workbench. "Could be memory gaps," I suggested, attempting rationality I didn't genuinely feel. "Stress affects cognitive function." "I photographed the workbench before bed," he countered. "Compared it this morning. Definite changes." Kevin maintained strategic silence regarding his situation, responding to messages with decreasing frequency. When he finally agreed to meet 3 weeks after the incident, his physical transformation shocked me. Significant weight loss, unkempt appearance, nervous mannerisms previously absent from his typically composed demeanor. "The security cameras captured something," he revealed, after ensuring no other patrons could overhear our conversation. 3 nights ago, around 2 a.m. He slid his phone across the table, displaying grainy night vision footage of his rear yard. Initially showing only normal suburban landscaping, at timestamp 2:17 a.m., a shadow detached from the tree line bordering his property. The figure, unmistakably human-shaped but lacking detailed features in the low-resolution recording, stood motionless at the yard's edge for approximately 8 minutes before retreating into the darkness. "Could be anyone," I suggested without conviction. "Neighbor, random trespasser." Kevin retrieved his phone, expression indicating he'd anticipated my skepticism. "It's happened 3 consecutive nights. Same time window, same behavior. Just watching the house." The revelation demolished my already fragile rationalization structure. Coincidental neighborhood prowlers might explain an isolated incident, but not recurring episodes targeting multiple individuals connected only by a specific shared experience. "Have you reported it? And tell police what? That someone stood at the edge of my property? They'll take a report and forget it immediately." His bitterness mirrored my own experience with law enforcement's response. "We need to consider what we might have encountered," I suggested carefully. "Beyond territorial hunters or landowners." "Don't start with conspiracy theories," Kevin warned. "That's a path to legitimate psychological breakdown." "Not conspiracies," I clarified. "Community practices. Regional customs that outsiders aren't meant to understand." This framing resonated with information fragments I'd accumulated through research. Isolated rural communities developing independent behavioral systems outside mainstream cultural norms. Throughout Appalachia and similar regions, geographical isolation had historically enabled the preservation of practices abandoned elsewhere. "Whatever's happening," I continued, "it's connected to that land, to the Jenkins property. Something about our presence there triggered a response that hasn't concluded." Kevin considered this perspective, his expression suggesting reluctant acceptance of its plausibility. "So what's the end game? What do they want from us?" The question crystallized our fundamental uncertainty. Traditional territorial warnings achieved their objective through our immediate departure. Extended surveillance and intimidation suggested different motivation, something beyond simple boundary enforcement. "Recognition," I proposed, the concept formulating as I articulated it. "Acknowledgement that we understand the warning and respect the boundary. Maybe we're supposed to demonstrate that somehow." This theory aligned with anthropological patterns of territorial dispute resolution in traditional societies. Violation required not only cessation, but formal acknowledgement of transgression. Our hasty departure might have satisfied physical removal without fulfilling the cultural requirement for proper acknowledgement. So what? We send an apology letter to a family we've never met for camping on unmarked private property? Kevin's skepticism contained undercurrents of desperate hope for simple resolution. Maybe something more direct, I suggested. Return to the boundary, not the actual property, and leave some form of acknowledgement. Traditional cultures often use symbolic exchanges to resolve territorial violations. The proposal contained obvious risks, but offered potential resolution that avoidance strategies had failed to provide. Kevin's expression registered intense conflict between rational rejection and desperate willingness to try anything that might end the psychological siege. "I'll talk to Jason," I assured him. "We'll approach this methodically." Kevin nodded without verbal agreement, but his posture reflected marginal relaxation, the first reduction in visible tension I'd observed since our meeting began. Whether my theory held validity remained uncertain, but the prospect of proactive response offered psychological benefit, independent of actual efficacy. As we parted ways, Kevin gripped my shoulder with unexpected intensity. "Whatever we decide, we stay together on this. No individual heroics." The instruction struck me as uncharacteristically dramatic for his typically reserved personality, yet perfectly aligned with our altered reality. The unspoken understanding between us acknowledged that conventional behavioral norms no longer applied to our situation. We had crossed an invisible boundary and entered territory governed by different rules. Rules we were struggling to decipher before consequences escalated beyond psychological intimidation. The solution crystallized from necessity rather than inspiration. After extensive consultation, Jason, Kevin, and I developed a response plan balancing rational skepticism with acknowledgement of inexplicable experiences. We would return to the general area, maintaining safe distance from the actual Jenkins property, and perform a symbolic acknowledgement of territorial violation and subsequent withdrawal. Research into traditional Appalachian customs provided limited guidance, but suggested the importance of reciprocal exchange, a token or offering representing recognition of established boundaries. The specific form mattered less than the deliberate ritual acknowledgement of transgression and commitment to future avoidance. We selected a neutral location approximately 1 mile from our original campsite, close enough to connect with the territory in question while remaining on clearly marked public land. The date, exactly 1 month after our initial experience, carried no specific significance beyond providing adequate preparation time. "This feels ridiculous," Jason commented as we assembled at the Forest Service trailhead on the appointed morning. Despite his verbal skepticism, his participation confirmed shared desperation for resolution. "Probably is," I acknowledged. "But conventional approaches haven't worked. Sometimes addressing irrational experiences requires stepping outside rational frameworks." Kevin remained silent, his attention directed toward the forest rather than our conversation. His security footage had captured additional nighttime observations during intervening weeks, establishing patterns that defied coincidental explanation. The psychological toll manifested in his physical appearance: significant weight loss, persistent insomnia indicators, hypervigilant posture. Our preparation included documentation of property boundaries to ensure we remained on public land throughout the process. The symbolic offering, a small wooden container containing salt, coins, and locally sourced tobacco, represented traditional elements from regional folklore regarding territorial acknowledgement. The forest presented entirely different characteristics in daylight compared to our memory of pre-dawn discovery. Sunlight penetrated the canopy in distinct shafts, creating illuminated pathways through otherwise shadowed understory. Wildlife sounds, bird calls, rustling vegetation, distant movement, created continuous audio texture that emphasized the previous unnatural silence we'd experienced. We hiked approximately 15 minutes to our designated location, A small clearing beside the official trail where Forest Service boundary markers clearly designated public land. The proximity to Jenkins' property remained tangible despite legal separation, an awareness heightened by our previous experience. This feels as far as we should go, I suggested, receiving immediate agreement from my companions. The ritual itself manifested as deliberately simplified ceremony. Placement of our offering container at the clearing's edge facing Jenkins' property, followed by verbal acknowledgement of boundary violation and commitment to future respect. The specific wording emerged spontaneously, emphasizing genuine regret for unintentional trespass rather than theatrical performance. We acknowledge crossing boundaries without permission, I stated toward the forest beyond the clearing. We recognize this territory belongs to others and commit to respecting those boundaries henceforth. Jason and Kevin added brief personal statements of similar sentiment. The process required less than 10 minutes total. Brief enough to seem insufficient, yet significant enough to establish deliberate intent. Whether anyone witnessed our performance remained unknown, though the sensation of observation persisted throughout. That's it? Jason questioned as we concluded. We're just assuming this resolves whatever's happening? We're acknowledging the possibility that our experience connects to territorial customs we don't fully understand, I clarified. Whether this specific response addresses those customs correctly remains uncertain. Kevin scanned the surrounding forest with evident apprehension. Something feels different. Not resolved, but acknowledged. His observation resonated with my own perception, an intangible shift in atmospheric pressure that defied rational explanation, but registered on some primitive awareness level. The forest retained its fundamental character but somehow conveyed different energy toward our presence, assessment rather than hostility. We departed without further ceremony, maintaining silent vigilance during our return hike. The sensation of observation persisted, though its quality had transformed from malevolent surveillance to neutral documentation. Whether this perception reflected actual external change or psychological projection remained indeterminable. The subsequent weeks brought gradual reduction in unexplained occurrences. Kevin reported no further night visitors captured on security footage. Jason's domestic anomalies ceased entirely. My own hypervigilance diminished incrementally, eventually returning to normal awareness patterns without conscious effort. We maintained regular communication throughout this period, documenting changes with scientific detachment that belied our emotional investment in resolution. By the 6th week following our acknowledgement ceremony, all 3 of us reported returning to normal sleep patterns and significantly reduced anxiety levels. So was it real or mass psychosis? Jason questioned during our final formal discussion of the experience. Both possibilities feature equally implausible elements, I replied. Either multiple independent observers experienced identical hallucinations, or traditional territorial practices include elements mainstream culture can't incorporate into its belief systems. Kevin, whose recovery had progressed most dramatically, offered pragmatic perspective. The observable reality is that something placed a skinned animal on Jason's truck while we slept. Everything after that involved our interpretation of that event, whether driven by external forces or internal psychology, ultimately makes little practical difference. This conclusion, while unsatisfying from purely rational perspective, provided functional resolution that allowed reintegration into normal life patterns. We achieved consensus that regardless of ultimate explanation, the experience warranted respect rather than dismissal, an encounter with forces beyond conventional understanding that demanded appropriate acknowledgement. I sometimes wake from dreams featuring that glistening skin displayed across metal, perfectly centered and deliberately positioned. The image retains its emotional impact despite temporal distance, triggering momentary disorientation before rational context reasserts itself. These episodes have diminished in frequency but persist as permanent psychological imprints, reminders of boundaries crossed and lessons painfully acquired. We haven't returned to those woods, nor do we intend to. Some territories remain better respectfully avoided, their boundaries acknowledged without challenge. The wilderness contains more than physical danger. It preserves ancient understanding that modern perspective has forgotten rather than transcended. Sometimes warnings deserve heeding without demanding explanation, and some messages communicate across cultural boundaries that rational discourse cannot bridge. The forest remembers what civilization has forgotten. Those who dwell at the boundaries between these worlds maintain traditions that protect separation necessary for both to survive. We crossed that boundary unknowingly and received appropriate response, a message delivered in primal language that even modern minds could not misinterpret. That knowledge remains our most valuable souvenir from an expedition that taught us wilderness extends beyond physical territory into realms of understanding where different rules apply. Some boundaries exist for valid reasons, and proper respect acknowledges not only their existence, but the wisdom behind their establishment.